Protests have been continuing across the United States against President Donald Trump's immigration crackdown and following the fatal shootings of civilians by federal agents in Minnesota. For more on this, we're joined today by Chris Casquejo, an independent journalist in Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Good to be with you.
So these anti-ICE protests have been intensifying across the country recently. How are people responding to the immigration crackdown, and what have you been seeing on the ground in Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, the protests have been growing in scale and scope, with hundreds of demonstrations held across the country in recent days. This includes marches, walkouts, and calls for general strikes, showing that this issue, this immigration crackdown, is resonating far beyond traditional anti-immigration enforcement activists. In Washington, D.C. here, the protests have been focused and symbolic, taking place on Capitol Hill and outside federal buildings. The mood is very urgent, with many protesters saying immigration enforcement now feels very personal and disruptive to daily life.
I see. And journalists were arrested for federal civil rights violations, while covering the anti-ICE protest at a church in Minnesota. Some are calling this media censorship. What's your take on this? And are journalists facing more obstacles under the Trump administration?
Yeah, this incident involving the two journalists at the anti-ICE protest at the church has really become a flashpoint for press freedom concerns here in the United States. Journalist and former CNN anchor Don Lemon said that a dozen federal agents arrested him despite his offer to surrender voluntarily. But authorities contend that this arrest of Lemon and another journalist were about disrupting a religious service and not about them practicing journalism. Now, press advocates warned that this risks criminalizing protest coverage and creating a chilling effect where it will discourage journalists from documenting what's going on and also citizens from documenting what's going on. More broadly, journalists covering immigration and protests are definitely facing increased legal and physical obstacles. We've seen several reports and instances of the local reporters in Minnesota getting tear gassed while covering these protests.
I see. And how visible is ICE activity in everyday life for people living in immigrant communities in the United States? How is it affecting the daily lives of Americans?
Yeah, it really depends on which city you're talking about. For example, in Minnesota, where this immigration enforcement operation is continuing, ICE activity has become highly visible, occurring in neighborhoods near workplaces and routine daily activities like Home Depots, other stores like that, and also schools, which is where immigration and authorities took in Liam Ramos, the 5-year-old who was recently released with his father from a detention center in Texas. Now, immigrant families report changing daily routines, avoiding schools, hospitals, and other public places out of fear. Even U.S. citizens in so-called mixed status families are affected. A mixed status family is a household where family members have different immigration statuses, often one of the family members being undocumented, while somebody else in the household is a U.S. citizen. Now, this impact extends way beyond arrest to widespread disruption of community life in places like Minnesota and Chicago, where the enforcement was happening just several weeks ago.
And what do you think is driving the administration to double down on immigration enforcement right now?
Well, immigration remains a key issue for President Donald Trump's base. The administration frames this as a law and order push and enforcement of existing laws. And officials appear determined not to back down in response to these protests, but at the same time, mounting scrutiny is shaping how enforcement is carried out. For example, authorities, the Department of Homeland Security announced that they would equip the officers with body cameras in Minnesota for the Border Patrol agents and ICE agents there, a step that supporters say could improve accountability, but the critics note that this is limited in scope to the Minnesota operation. Now, taken all together, this suggests that the administration is trying to hold the line on enforcement while making some tactical adjustments, increasing the transparency while reducing their legal risks without changing the underlying immigration enforcement policy because of some of the optics. You know, there were two people who were shot in Minneapolis for observing and encountering these officers.
All right, where do you see this heading? Is there any chance we'll see a possible shift in the Trump administration's immigration policy?
Short term, I don't think you will. I mean, they've announced that they are going to expand this immigration crackdown to other cities like Springfield, Ohio. But public opinion is moving, so that is something to watch. Watch the polls. Recent Reuters and Ipsos polling shows that a majority of Americans now disapprove of how immigration enforcement is being handled, with approval well below 40%. Even among the voters who supported President Trump's tougher border controls, there's growing concern that the enforcement tactics have gone too far, especially when it comes to use of force and transparency. Remember, in the case of the shooting of Renee Good and Alex Preddy, the administration had called them domestic terrorists and said that they had brandished weapons, or she had run into the officers, where the video showed otherwise, and that was not the case. For Donald Trump, immigration remains a core political issue, so a sudden shift is unlikely. But as we move closer to the November midterms that are going to decide the control of Congress, you might see a shift in public opinion, sustained public pressure, increased scrutiny from the courts, and, you know, the politics will play all into that. So we'll just have to see how it all plays out with all these factors involved.
I see. I guess we'll have to see how that goes. All right. Thank you so much for your time and insight this morning. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Good to be with you again.